When my neighbor Helga disappeared in 1985, the entire neighborhood searched for her. Police investigated my house, asked questions, but found nothing. For 40 years, everyone wondered, where did Helga go? But every morning as I drank my coffee, I knew she was right beneath me. Now, before I die, it's time to tell the truth. This confession reveals the darkest side of silence and guilt. If you're ready to hear the shocking truth about what happened in that basement, subscribe now. Hit the bell and never miss one of our chilling confessions from elderly voices who can no longer stay silent. And before we begin, drop your age in the comments below. I want to know, how old are you when you first hear a secret this dark? The house on Bergman Street had always been quiet. Too quiet, some neighbors used to say, though they never knew why. For 40 years, Margarete Schroeder lived there alone, or so everyone believed. The white facade, the neat garden, the lace curtains that never moved. A picture of ordinary life. But ordinary is often where the darkest secrets hide. Margarete was 83 now. Her hands trembled when she poured her morning coffee, her knees ached when she climbed the stairs, and her heart, well, her heart carried a weight no doctor could measure. For 4 decades, she had lived with a truth so terrible that even thinking about it made her chest tighten. But time was running out. The cancer diagnosis had been clear, 6 months, maybe less, and she realized that some secrets are too heavy to take to the grave. It started in the summer of 1985. Back then, Margarete was 43, recently widowed, and struggling to keep her late husband's house. The mortgage was crushing her. She needed a tenant, someone to rent the small basement apartment she had converted years ago. That's when Helga Brandt answered the advertisement. Helga was 51, a quiet woman with sad eyes and no family. She worked nights at a textile factory and kept to herself. Perfect, Margarete thought. A tenant who wouldn't disturb her grief, who wouldn't ask too many questions. The arrangement seemed ideal. Helga moved in on a humid July evening, carrying only 2 suitcases and a box of books. She paid 3 months' rent in advance, cash, and asked for no receipt. Margarete should have found that strange, but money was money, and she needed it desperately. The first month passed without incident. Helga came and went through the separate basement entrance. Sometimes Margarete heard her footsteps below, the faint sound of water running through old pipes, the creak of a bed frame. Normal sounds, the sounds of someone living. But there were other sounds too, sounds that came late at night when Helga returned from her factory shift. Sounds of weeping, long muffled sobs that seeped through the floorboards and into Margarete's sleepless nights. Margarete told herself it wasn't her business. Everyone had their sorrows. She had hers, Helga had hers. But curiosity is a persistent thing, especially for a lonely widow with too much time and too many empty rooms. She began to notice things. Helga never received mail, never had visitors, never made phone calls, at least none that Margarete could hear. It was as if Helga was hiding from something, or someone. One evening in late August, Margarete heard voices from the basement, 2 voices. One was Helga's, higher-pitched pleading. The other was deeper, masculine, angry. Margarete pressed her ear against the floor of her living room, her heart pounding. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Threatening, violent. Then came a crash, the sound of something, or someone hitting a wall. Then silence. Margarete waited. 10 minutes. 20. Nothing. She should have called the police. That's what any reasonable person would have done. But Margarete had learned, in her 43 years of life, that getting involved in other people's problems only brought trouble. Besides, what would she say? That she heard an argument. That wasn't a crime. So she did nothing. She went to bed, pulled the covers over her head, and tried to forget the sounds. The next morning, she knocked on Helga's door. No answer. She knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. She tried the handle. It was locked. Margarete told herself that Helga had probably left early for work, or perhaps gone out for groceries. But something felt wrong. The air felt different, heavier somehow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. 3 days passed. No sign of Helga. No sounds from the basement. No footsteps, no running water, no creaking bed. Just silence. On the 4th day, Margarete used her spare key to enter the basement apartment. She told herself she was worried, that she was being a responsible landlord. But deep down, she knew she was terrified of what she might find. The apartment was dark. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the afternoon sun. Margarete fumbled for the light switch, her hand shaking. When the bulb flickered to life, she saw it immediately. Blood. Not a lot, but enough. A dark stain on the concrete floor near the small kitchenette, partially wiped but still visible. And next to it a broken lamp, its ceramic base shattered into pieces. Margarete's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. What had happened here? Where was Helga? She should call the police. She should report this. But then another thought crept in, cold and calculating. If the police came, they would ask questions. They would investigate. They would discover that Margarete had heard the argument, that she had done nothing. They might even suspect her. A widow, alone, desperate for money, with a missing tenant who paid in cash and left no trace. She couldn't risk it. She had to think. She had to be smart. Margarete spent the next hour cleaning. She scrubbed the blood stain with bleach until her hands burned. She swept up the broken lamp and buried the pieces in her garden. She wiped down every surface, every doorknob, every counter. She opened the windows to air out the smell of cleaning chemicals. When she was finished, the apartment looked untouched, as if Helga had simply packed up and left. But Helga hadn't left. Margarete knew that now someone had hurt her badly. And whoever that person was, they had taken Helga away or left her somewhere. Margarete told herself it wasn't her fault. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just protecting herself, protecting her home, her reputation. But deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, she knew she was complicit. She had chosen silence over truth, safety over justice. A week later, Helga's employer called. They were looking for her. She hadn't shown up for her shifts. Was everything all right? Margarete lied smoothly, easily. She said Helga had moved out suddenly, that she had mentioned something about going back to her hometown, somewhere up north. The employer seemed satisfied. The matter was dropped. 2 weeks after that, a man came to the door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with cold eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He asked about Helga. He said he was a friend. Margarete felt ice crawl down her spine. This was him, the man from that night, the man with the angry voice. She kept her face neutral, her voice steady. She repeated her story. Helga had moved out, gone up north, left no forwarding address. The man stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of deception. Then he nodded, thanked her, and left. Margarete locked the door behind him and collapsed against it, her entire body shaking. She knew with absolute certainty that he had killed Helga, and she knew with equal certainty that she could never tell anyone, because if she did, she would be next. For months she avoided the basement. She kept the door locked, the key hidden in a drawer she never opened. She tried to forget, tried to move on, but the guilt gnawed at her, persistent and relentless. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of her vision reminded her of what she knew, of what she had done and what she hadn't done. Then, one cold November evening, there was a knock on her door. Police. They were investigating Helga's disappearance. Someone at the factory had filed a missing person report. They asked if Margaretti knew anything. She repeated her story, calm and composed. She had practiced it so many times in her head that it came out perfectly. Helga had moved out, said she was going up north, paid her rent and left. No forwarding address, no contact information. The police made notes, asked a few more questions, then thanked her and left. But they came back. 3 more times over the next 2 months. They searched the basement apartment. They found nothing, of course. Margaretti had cleaned too well. They interviewed neighbors. No one had seen anything suspicious. Eventually the investigation stalled. Helga Brandt became just another missing person, another cold case file gathering dust in some archive, and Margaretti breathed easier. The danger had passed. She could move on, but she couldn't rent out the basement again. The thought of someone else living there, sleeping in that space, walking on that floor, it was unbearable, so she sealed it off. She told people the apartment needed renovations, that the pipes were old, the foundation cracked, and over time people stopped asking. Years passed, then decades. The world changed. Margaretti grew older, grayer, slower. The house aged with her, its paint peeling, its garden overgrowing. But the basement remained sealed, untouched, forgotten by everyone except her. Until now, until the cancer, until the knowing that time was running out, and the weight of this secret was crushing her from the inside. Because there was something Margaretti hadn't told anyone, something she had discovered 3 days after the police closed their investigation, something that made everything so much worse. She had gone down to the basement one last time, intending to seal it permanently. She was going to pour concrete over the old floor, create a solid barrier between her and the past. She hired a contractor, a young man who asked no questions and worked for cash. While he was mixing the concrete, Margaretti went down to take one final look at the space. That's when she found it. Behind a loose panel in the wall, hidden in the crawl space, a body, Helga's body, wrapped in plastic sheeting, stuffed into the narrow gap between the foundation and the outer wall. The man must have hidden her there that night, must have come back after Margaretti went to bed and dragged her into that dark, cramped space. Margaretti stood there, frozen, staring at the wrapped form. She should scream. She should run. She should call the police immediately. But all she could think was, if they find this, they'll know I lied. They'll know I cleaned the blood. They'll know I covered it up. So she made a choice. The worst choice of her life. She said nothing to the contractor. She let him pour the concrete, layer after layer, sealing the crawl space, sealing Helga, sealing the truth. She watched as the fresh concrete spread across the floor, smooth and grey and final. And when it was done, she paid the man and sent him away. For 40 years, Helga Brandt lay beneath that concrete floor. And for 40 years, Margaretti Schroeder lived above her, drinking her morning coffee, tending her garden, smiling at her neighbors, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. Now sitting in her living room at 83, with cancer eating away at her insides, Margaretti understood that some sins don't fade with time. They calcify, harden, become part of your very bones. And she understood something else too. She was running out of time to make this right, or at least to tell the truth. The question was, would anyone believe her? And more importantly, did she have the courage to confess? The first year was the hardest. Every sound in the house made Margaretti jump. Every knock on the door sent her heart racing. She developed insomnia, lying awake night after night, listening to the silence from below. Sometimes she imagined she could hear things, scratching, tapping, whispers, but she knew it was just her mind, torturing her with guilt and fear. She stopped inviting people over. When neighbors asked to come in for coffee, she made excuses. The house was a mess. She wasn't feeling well. Maybe another time. They eventually stopped asking. She became known as the reclusive widow on Bergman Street, the woman who kept to herself. People assumed it was grief over her husband. They had no idea what she was really mourning. The second year brought a different kind of torment. Normalization. Life, as it tends to do, moved on. The neighborhood forgot about Helga Brandt. The missing person case went cold. New families moved in. New children played in the streets. New gossip circulated. The world kept turning, indifferent to the body sealed beneath Margaretti's house. And Margaretti found, to her horror, that she was adapting. The nightmares became less frequent. The panic attacks subsided. She learned to walk across her living room without thinking about what lay below. She learned to smile at neighbors, to make small talk at the grocery store, to act like everything was fine, because in a way, everything was fine. She was safe. No one suspected. No one knew. But there were moments when the facade cracked. Once she was watching the evening news when a story came on about a missing woman whose body had been found in a river after 15 years. The woman's family appeared on screen, weeping with a mixture of grief and relief. At least now they knew. At least now they could have closure, could hold a funeral, could say goodbye. Margaretti turned off the television and sat in the dark, crying. Helga had no family to mourn her, no one to demand answers, no one to keep searching. She had been utterly alone in life, and she remained alone in death. And Margaretti had ensured she would stay that way forever. The guilt would surge up like this sometimes, overwhelming and sudden, but then it would recede, sink back down into whatever dark place Margaretti kept it locked away. And she would continue, because what else could she do? Confess, go to prison at her age. Destroy what little life she had left. The rational part of her mind always won these arguments. Silence was survival. Truth was destruction. By the 5th year, Margaretti had almost convinced herself that she had done nothing wrong. She hadn't killed Helga. She hadn't even witnessed the murder. She had simply protected herself, made a practical decision in an impossible situation. Anyone would have done the same, she told herself. Anyone with sense, with self-preservation instincts. She was the victim here too, in a way. A victim of circumstance, of bad luck, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This rationalization became her armor. She wore it daily, polished it until it shone, until she could almost believe it completely. Almost. The 10th anniversary of Helga's disappearance passed without acknowledgement. No one remembered. No one marked the date. Margaretti baked herself a cake that day, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was her way of acknowledging the truth, even if only to herself. She ate one slice and threw the rest away. Life continued its slow, steady march forward. Margaretti's hair turned completely white. Her joints stiffened. She needed reading glasses, then a cane, then someone to help with the garden. A young man from down the street started doing her yard work. He was kind, polite, always asked about her health. Sometimes Margarete wanted to tell him, wanted to grab his arm and whisper, "There's a body under my house. A woman who deserved better. A woman I betrayed." But she never did. The words stayed locked in her throat. 20 years after Helga's death, the house needed repairs. The roof was leaking, the plumbing was failing, the foundation, God, the foundation. An inspector came, a cheerful middle-aged man with a clipboard and a flashlight. He needed to check the basement, he said. Margarete felt her blood turn to ice. She led him down the stairs, her hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The basement looked different now. She had filled it with storage boxes over the years, old furniture, broken appliances, layers of junk, hiding layers of guilt. The inspector walked across the concrete floor, tapping it with his flashlight, making notes. Margarete watched him, barely breathing. He declared the foundation sound, old but sound, no major issues. Margarete thanked him with a smile that felt like cracking glass on her face. When he left, she locked the basement door and didn't go down there again for 3 years. But time, that relentless eroder of all things, began to work on the house. And on Margarete, cracks appeared in the walls, in the foundation, in her carefully constructed piece. Small at first, then wider. The house was settling, the inspector had said, normal for a structure of its age. But to Margarete, every crack felt like an accusation, a finger pointing at her crime. She started having dreams. In them, Helga was alive, walking through the house, leaving wet footprints on the floor. Sometimes Helga spoke, asking simple questions. Why? How could you? Other times, she just stood there staring with those sad eyes, waiting for something Margarete could never give. Margarete visited a doctor about the dreams. She was prescribed sleeping pills. They helped, but they also dulled everything else. Her memory, her alertness, her ability to maintain the careful performance of normalcy. She stopped taking them. Better to be haunted than to be vulnerable. The 30th year brought a new terror. The city announced plans to upgrade the water and sewage systems in the neighborhood. Every house would need to be inspected, the basements examined, new pipes installed. Margarete received the notice in the mail and felt her world collapse. They would find her, they would dig, would break through the concrete, would discover what lay beneath. After 30 years of silence, the truth would finally emerge. She would be arrested, tried, imprisoned. She would die in a cell, alone and despised. Everything she had protected, everything she had sacrificed her conscience for, would be destroyed. For 3 weeks, Margarete barely slept, barely ate. She sat in her living room, staring at the floor, waiting for the inevitable. She considered running, but where would she go? She was 73 years old with arthritis and high blood pressure. She couldn't even drive anymore. Then came the reprieve. Budget cuts. The city postponed the project indefinitely. The notice came in the same bureaucratic language as the first one, but to Margarete, it read like a pardon from God. She wept with relief, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. But the close call changed something in her. The armor she had built, the rationalization she had perfected, began to crack. She started going to church, something she hadn't done since her husband's funeral. She sat in the back pew, listening to sermons about forgiveness and redemption, wondering if such things could ever apply to her. Could God forgive her? Could she forgive herself? The priest was a young man, earnest and idealistic. After one service, he approached her, asked if she wanted to talk, if something was troubling her. Margarete looked at his kind face and almost told him everything. The words were right there, pressing against her teeth, desperate to escape, but she swallowed them back down. The confessional had its limits. Some sins were too heavy even for divine intervention. She stopped going to church after that. The 35th year brought physical decline. Her heart started acting up, skipping beats, fluttering irregularly. The doctor prescribed medication and warned her to reduce stress. Reduce stress. The irony almost made her laugh. How do you reduce stress when you're living on top of a grave? She started writing, nothing she would ever show anyone, just private journals where she could finally tell the truth. Page after page of confession, of guilt, of self-justification and self-loathing. She wrote about Helga, about the night she disappeared, about the decision to pour the concrete. She wrote about the man with cold eyes, wondering if he was still alive, if he still thought about what he had done. She wrote about fear and survival and the terrible prices we pay for both. When she finished each journal, she burned it in her fireplace. The truth turned to ash and drifted up the chimney, scattered into the sky. Gone but not forgotten. Never forgotten. By year 40, Margarete had become a ghost in her own life. She moved through her days mechanically, eating meals she didn't taste, watching television shows she didn't see, existing without truly living. The house had become her prison, and she was both the guard and the inmate. Then came the diagnosis. Cancer, stage 4. Aggressive. The doctor spoke in calm, measured tones about treatment options, survival rates, quality of life. But Margarete heard only one thing: you're dying. Finally, after 40 years of waiting, death was coming for her. She felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Relief, because death meant an end. An end to the guilt, the fear, the constant performance of normalcy. An end to living above a grave, to carrying this terrible weight. Death meant peace. But as the weeks passed, and the cancer took hold, as her body weakened and her time dwindled, Margarete began to realize something else. Death meant the secret would die with her. Helga would remain buried, forgotten, unmourned. The man who killed her would never face justice, and Margarete herself would escape the consequences of her choices, her cowardice, her 40 years of silence. That didn't feel like peace. It felt like one final betrayal. She started thinking about confession. Real confession, not burned journals or silent prayers. Telling the police, facing the consequences, whatever they might be. At 83 with terminal cancer, what could they do to her? Prison, death row. She would die in a hospital or die in a cell. Was there really any difference at this point? But every time she reached for the phone, every time she thought about calling the authorities, something stopped her. Pride, maybe, or fear, or perhaps just the crushing weight of habit, 40 years of keeping the secret, of protecting herself. The question haunted her: was it better to die with the truth, or to die with the lie? She didn't know. Even now, with time running out and death closing in, she genuinely didn't know what the right choice was. All she knew was that Helga Brandt deserved better, deserved a grave with her name on it, deserved to be mourned, deserved to have her story told, and the only person who could give her that was Margarete. But could she? After 40 years of silence, did she have the courage to finally speak? The answer came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, Margarete found a picture she had forgotten about. It was from a neighborhood barbecue in the summer of 1985, just weeks before Helga disappeared. Someone had captured a moment. Margarete and Helga standing together by the grill, both holding paper plates, both smiling at the camera. Margarete stared at that photograph for hours. She had never noticed before how young Helga looked in that moment, despite being 51. How the smile reached her eyes. How she seemed for just that frozen instant happy. And Margarete realized that this was what she had stolen. Not just a life, but all the possible futures that life could have held. Helga might have found love again, might have traveled, pursued dreams, experienced joy. Or maybe she would have continued in her quiet, sad existence. It didn't matter. The point was, she deserved the chance to find out. And Margarete had taken that from her. Not directly, but through her silence. Through her choice to protect herself instead of seeking justice for someone who had no one else to fight for her. That night, Margarete made her decision. She would confess, not for redemption. It was too late for that. Not for forgiveness, she didn't deserve it, but for Helga, so that someone somewhere would know her story, would know she existed, that she mattered, that her death was not meaningless. But there was one problem, one final complication that Margarete hadn't anticipated. The man with the cold eyes, the killer. If Margarete confessed, would they find him? Would he finally face justice? Or was he already dead, having lived a full life and escaped punishment entirely? And more troubling, if they identified him, if they arrested him, would he tell them about Margarete's role? Would he reveal that she knew, that she helped cover it up, that she chose silence over truth? Would her confession be the act of courage she hoped, or would it be the final damning proof of her guilt? Margarete didn't know, but she was running out of time to decide. The envelope sat on Margarete's kitchen table for 3 days before she touched it. Plain white, unremarkable, the kind you could buy at any store. But inside it was a letter that would change everything, or destroy everything, depending on how you looked at it. She had written and rewritten it a dozen times over the past week, each version slightly different, each attempting to capture the impossible, how to confess to 40 years of silence, how to explain the inexplicable, how to take responsibility without making excuses. The final version was 5 pages long, handwritten in her careful script, every word chosen with precision, every sentence a small act of courage. The letter began simply, "My name is Margarete Schroeder, and I know where Helga Brandt is." From there it told everything. The argument she heard in August 1985, the blood she found and cleaned, the body she discovered behind the wall, the concrete she allowed to be poured, the 40 years of silence, the fear, the guilt, the rationalization, the slow corrosion of her soul. She left nothing out, spared herself nothing. If she was going to confess, it would be complete. The letter ended with an apology, not to the police, not to society, but to Helga. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to help you when it mattered. I'm sorry I chose my safety over your justice. I'm sorry you spent 40 years alone in the dark. You deserved so much better than what life gave you, and you deserved so much better than what I gave you. I can't undo my choices, but I can finally tell the truth. I hope that counts for something." Margarete addressed the envelope to the police department. She even walked to the mailbox on the corner, the letter clutched in her trembling hand, but she couldn't drop it in. Not yet, because once she did, there would be no taking it back. The truth would be out, unstoppable, final. She walked back home, the letter still in her hand, and sat in her living room, staring at the floor, the concrete floor beneath which Helga lay. She had walked on this floor 10,000 times, maybe more, had sat in this exact spot, this exact chair for 40 years. And all that time, Helga had been right there, just feet away, waiting. "I'm trying," Margaretti whispered to the empty room. "I'm trying to be brave." But bravery, she was learning, wasn't a single moment of courage. It was a decision you had to make over and over again, every time fear told you to stop, every time self-preservation screamed at you to stay silent. And she was so tired of being afraid. The next morning, Margaretti woke with a strange sense of clarity. She had dreamed of Helga again, but this time it was different. They were in the basement together, but it was bright and clean, with sunlight streaming through windows that didn't exist in reality. Helga was younger, healthier, smiling that smile from the photograph. She didn't speak, but she nodded at Margaretti, a small gesture that somehow conveyed understanding, maybe even forgiveness. When Margaretti opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do. She called a lawyer first. She needed to understand what would happen, what the legal consequences would be. The lawyer was young, professional, confused by her questions. When she explained vaguely that she had information about a decades-old crime, but was also implicated in its cover-up, he advised her strongly against saying anything without legal representation. He could meet with her, they could discuss options, they could negotiate with prosecutors for immunity or reduced charges. Margaretti thanked him and hung up. She didn't want immunity. She didn't want reduced charges. She wanted to tell the truth. Consequences be damned. At 83 with terminal cancer, prison held no fear for her anymore. Death held no fear. The only thing she feared was dying with this secret, taking it to her grave while Helga remained in hers, unknown and unmourned. Instead of mailing the letter, Margaretti decided to deliver it in person. She wanted to see their faces when she told them, wanted to answer their questions, fill in every detail, help them understand exactly what happened and where to find her. She owed Helga that much, a complete accounting, a thorough confession, a proper investigation. She dressed carefully that morning, as if preparing for an important appointment, which in a way she was. This was perhaps the most important thing she would ever do. She chose her best dress, the dark blue one she saved for special occasions. She did her hair, applied a touch of lipstick, put on her pearl earrings. She wanted to look dignified, respectable. She wanted them to see her as a person, not a monster. The police station was a 20-minute bus ride away. Margaretti hadn't taken the bus in years, usually relying on a neighbor for rides to doctor's appointments. But today she wanted to do this alone. The bus was nearly empty, just her and a few teenagers absorbed in their phones. They didn't look at her, didn't notice the elderly woman clutching her purse, preparing to confess to a crime 4 decades old. The station was smaller than she remembered. She had been here once before, 40 years ago, when they questioned her about Helga's disappearance. She had sat in that same waiting area, had given her statement with a calm voice and steady hands, had lied so smoothly that they never suspected a thing. The irony wasn't lost on her now, returning to the same place to finally tell the truth. The officer at the front desk was young, couldn't have been more than 25. He looked up as she approached, his expression polite but disinterested. "Can I help you?" Margaretti took a deep breath. This was it, the moment everything changed. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need to report a murder. Well, not report exactly. I need to confess to covering up a murder. From 40 years ago." The officer's expression shifted from disinterest to confusion to alert attention in the space of seconds. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" "My name is Margaretti Schroeder. In 1985, a woman named Helga Brandt was killed in the basement of my house. Her body is still there, buried under concrete. I knew about it. I helped cover it up, and I've been silent for 40 years. But I'm not silent anymore." The officer stared at her for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if she was serious or suffering from dementia. Then he picked up his phone. "I need a detective down here." Now, what followed was a blur of activity. Detectives, questions, a small interview room with a tape recorder. Margaretti told them everything, exactly as she had written in the letter, which she also provided for their records. She described the argument she heard, the blood she found, the body behind the wall, the decision to pour concrete. She gave them the contractor's name. He was probably dead by now, or too old to remember, but she gave it anyway. She described the man with cold eyes who had come looking for Helga, though she had never learned his name. The detectives listened with expressions that cycled through skepticism, shock, and grim professional focus. They asked hundreds of questions. Why had she stayed silent? Why confess now? Did she have any proof? Was she sure about what she saw? To that last question, Margaretti gave a sad smile. "I've had 40 years to be sure. I walk across that concrete floor every day. I know exactly where she is." They asked if she would allow them to search her house. She agreed immediately. "That's why I'm here. I want you to find her. She deserves to be found." The search began that afternoon. Margaretti watched from her living room as forensic teams arrived, as ground-penetrating radar was brought in, as the basement she had sealed off for decades was finally opened. She sat in her chair, the same chair she had sat in for 40 years, and waited. It took 3 hours. The radar confirmed an anomaly beneath the concrete. They brought in jackhammers, carefully breaking through the floor she had walked across 10,000 times. And then, just as the sun was setting, they found her. Helga Brandt, wrapped in deteriorating plastic, exactly where Margaretti said she would be. After 40 years, she was finally coming home. Margaretti was arrested. Of course. They read her rights, handcuffed her wrists, gently given her age, and led her to a police car. Neighbors watched from their windows, shocked and confused. The quiet old woman from number 42, arrested for murder. It didn't make sense, but Margaretti felt something she hadn't felt in 4 decades, as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The secret was out. The truth was known. Helga would have a proper burial, a proper investigation. Her death would be acknowledged. She would matter. The legal proceedings were complicated. Margaretti's lawyer, not the first one she called, but a different one appointed by the court, argued that she hadn't actually committed murder, that her crime was accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. Given her age, her terminal illness, and the fact that she had voluntarily come forward, he pushed for leniency. The prosecutor wanted prison time. 40 years of obstruction, he argued, deserved serious consequences. The victim's family, it turned out Helga had a distant cousin, her only living relative, wanted justice, whatever that meant. In the end, Margaretti pled guilty to all charges. She refused to fight it, refused to minimize her responsibility. "I'm guilty," she told the judge at her sentencing hearing. "I was guilty 40 years ago, and I'm guilty now. I don't deserve mercy, but I hope that by finally telling the truth, by finally giving Helga the justice she deserved, I've done something right. It's 40 years too late, but it's the only thing I can offer." The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, looked at Margaretti for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Mrs. Schroeder, you committed a serious crime. Your silence denied Miss Brandt justice, denied her family closure, and allowed a killer to potentially walk free. However, your voluntary confession, your cooperation with investigators, and your terminal condition are significant factors. I sentence you to 5 years in prison, suspended due to your medical condition, with the requirement that you remain in hospice care under supervision. You will be fitted with an ankle monitor and will assist the police in any ongoing investigation into Miss Brandt's murder." Margaretti nodded. It was more lenient than she expected, less than she deserved, but it would serve its purpose. The investigation into Helga's killer took an unexpected turn. Using the description Margaretti provided and old police records, detectives identified a suspect, Klaus Werner, a man with a history of domestic violence who had been briefly questioned in 1985 but never charged. He had died 8 years ago, taking his crimes with him to the grave. They found one other thing, though. In Klaus Werner's effects, stored in his daughter's attic, was a box of personal items. Among them was a photograph of Helga and a letter she had written to him, dated August 1985, telling him she was leaving him, that she was afraid of him, that she had finally found the courage to escape. The letter ended with a warning: "If anything happens to me, you'll be the one responsible." She had been right. And now, 40 years later, the world finally knew. Helga Brandt was buried in the city cemetery on a cold November day. Her distant cousin attended, as did a few people from the textile factory who still remembered her. And Margaretti, escorted by a police officer due to her ankle monitor, stood at the back of the small gathering, paying her respects to the woman she had failed so completely. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, a proper grave this time, with a headstone and flowers and people who cared, Margaretti felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." She didn't know if Helga could hear her, didn't know if apologies mattered to the dead. But she said it anyway, over and over, until the ceremony ended and she was led back to the police car. Margaretti Schroeder lived for 4 more months after her confession. The cancer, perhaps emboldened by the stress of the trial, progressed rapidly. She spent her final days in a hospice facility, surrounded by nurses who knew her story, but treated her with surprising kindness. She had visitors, though not many. The detective who had taken her confession came a few times, asking follow-up questions about Klaus Werner, trying to determine if there might be other victims. Margaretti told him everything she remembered, every detail, hoping it might help. Helga's cousin came once. She didn't say much, just sat in the chair next to Margaretti's bed and looked at her. Finally she spoke. "I don't forgive you. I can't. You let her stay in the dark for 40 years. But I'm glad you told the truth. She deserved that much." Margaretti nodded. She deserved so much more. "I'm sorry I couldn't give it to her when it mattered." The cousin left, and Margaretti never saw her again. In her final days, Margaretti drifted in and out of consciousness, the morphine blurring the line between waking and dreaming. She dreamed of Helga often, but not the sad, haunting dreams of before. In these dreams, Helga was free, walking in sunlight, smiling. Sometimes she would turn and wave at Margaretti, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Margaretti died on a Tuesday morning in March, with a nurse holding her hand. Her last words were, "Tell her I'm sorry." The nurse, who knew the story, nodded. "I'm sure she knows." There was no funeral for Margaretti Schroeder. She had no family, no close friends, no one to mourn her passing. Her house was sold to pay legal fees and restitution to Helga's estate. The basement was demolished as part of the renovation, the concrete torn up and carted away, every trace of the crime erased. But the story didn't end there. Margaretti's confession, her testimony, her letters, they became part of the public record. Journalists wrote articles about the case, the elderly woman who lived with a terrible secret for 40 years, the victim who was finally given justice. Some portrayed Margaretti as a coward, others as someone who found courage in her final days. The truth, as always, was more complicated. What no one disputed was this: Helga Brandt had been forgotten, erased, treated as if she didn't matter. And Margaretti Schroeder, for all her failures and her 4 decades of silence, had finally given her a voice. In the end, confession hadn't brought redemption. Margaretti understood that. Some sins are too large for redemption, some betrayals too deep for forgiveness. But confession had brought truth, and truth, even 40 years late, even at the cost of everything, mattered. Helga Brandt's grave in the city cemetery is modest but well maintained. Someone, no one knows who, leaves fresh flowers there every month. The headstone reads, Helga Brandt 1934 to 1985, finally at peace. And beneath those words, added later by an anonymous hand, a simple phrase, you were not forgotten. It's not enough. It can never be enough. But it's something, a recognition, a remembrance, a small act of dignity for someone who deserved so much more. And perhaps that's all we can hope for in this life, that when we fail, when we betray, when we choose silence over courage, we might eventually find the strength to make it right, even if it's too late, even if it costs us everything, even if we never receive forgiveness. Because truth matters, justice matters, and every person, no matter how invisible their life might seem, deserves to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. Helga Brandt mattered. And now, finally, the world knows her name. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel now. Every week I bring you new mysterious confessions from older people, stories of secrets, guilt and truths revealed later in life. These narratives remind us that it's never too late to do the right thing, even if the price is high. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story. One last question for you. Do you think Margaretti did the right thing by telling the truth after 40 years? Share your opinion in the comments.